All right, next we've got Gil Goldshlager from the University of California, Berkeley. His field's applied mathematics. His advisor is Lin, and his practicum is at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. Thanks, Gil.
All right. Thanks for the introduction. Really happy to be here, fourth-year fellow, to talk about the work I've been doing over my PhD the last few years towards high-precision optimizers for scientific machine learning. So this is collaborative work with all these people, my PhD advisor, Professor Lin, and a bunch of other people, postdocs and students and professors who, a lot of whom I probably wouldn't have necessarily been able to work to without actually the support of the fellowship. So to get started, I want to give a couple of pieces of motivation for this work. And the first one comes from the field of neural wave functions. So the idea here is we want to solve some quantum many-body systems. For example, we want to simulate a molecule or a material or solid. And I'm just going to drop this. And so if we want to do this, let's say we want to find a ground state wave function, then we can formulate this mathematically as the minimization of a Rayleigh quotient. And the idea here is we have some physical Hamiltonian. We have some variational parameters theta. These parameterize a wave function, which we write psi sub theta. And if we can minimize this simple mathematical formula over our parameters, we can hope to get a good approximation to a ground state wave function. And the question then is, how do we actually represent the wave function? And so we've heard several previous talks about quantum chemistry and other sorts of quantum systems with different wave function representations. One way that you can represent the wave function, particularly for strongly correlated systems where a lot of other methods break down, is to use a neural network. And so this is where we get the idea of neural wave functions. And I think this is a very promising approach for strong correlation and was the initial motivation for the work I'm going to talk about. Another motivation, though, which is quite similar, comes from the field of physics-informed neural networks. So here, we want to solve some sort of a PDE instead of a quantum system. We can also represent this as some sort of a minimization function with a slightly more complicated loss function. And again, we have the same kind of question. If we want to solve this thing, how do we represent the actual solution to the PDE? And at least for certain problems where traditional solvers fail, perhaps high-dimensional problems, or for solving large families of PDEs, it can also be interesting to look at using a neural network as the ansatz. And so these are two motivations, and I think there's substantial promise in both of these directions, but they also have some challenges. And in particular, one of the challenges they face that is pretty well known is the optimization challenge. And so to kind of put this at a very high level, the challenge is basically that we're trying to train neural networks, so we need our optimizer to be highly scalable. We need to be able to run, for example, on GPUs or high-performance computing clusters with millions of variational parameters to train. But on the other hand, we're doing science, so we don't just need to predict like something a cat or a dog. We need high-precision answers to usually many digits of accuracy. And the question then becomes, how can we actually do this sort of scalable and high-precision optimization? And what's interesting is that a lot of the existing methods really don't actually meet these requirements. So for example, in the machine learning community, what people are doing for optimization is basically using gradient descent. So you just look in the direction, the gradient direction of the loss function, you just move in that direction. And the reason this is used is it's super scalable, but it's really not tailored for high-precision scientific computation. These methods converge very, very slowly, especially to sort of trailing digits of accuracy. And so that's not quite the paradigm we need. And similarly, in scientific computing, people do care about precision, and usually the paradigm for this, to sort of summarize it at a very high level, is preconditioning. So things like Newton methods, quasi-Newton methods, Gauss-Newton methods. And these are, again, these are great because they're very high precision, but they're usually not very scalable. So if you try to just train a neural network with 1 million parameters using some of these methods, they're either going to run out of memory, or they're not going to complete a single iteration, they're not going to be stable, it's not just going to work. And so this leaves us with this sort of question of, if we want to actually do scientific machine learning, we need scalability and high precision, then actually what kind of optimizers are we going to be able to use? And so this is sort of the main question I've been thinking about for the last couple of years, and just like to share some thoughts on in the next two parts of this talk. And so with that, I'm going to briefly switch gears and talk about something that's initially slightly unrelated. So this is something called the sketch and project paradigm, which is really coming from the randomized linear algebra community. And this is set in a very simple setting. So let's say we just want to solve a linear system, AX equals B, where A is some matrix, B is a vector. And the sketch and project method is a very particular way to solve a linear system like that, which I'll give a brief overview of. And so the idea is we have some solution we're trying to target, we have some initial guess, and it's an iterative algorithm where at each iteration we're going to run two steps, right? Sketch and project. And the sketch step is basically applying a matrix. This is going to be a short wide matrix to both sides of the linear system, which is basically a dimensionality reduction map to compress all the information from a potentially high dimension into a much lower dimension. And so this gives us a much smaller, more tractable linear system we can solve, but it doesn't fully constrain the solution because we've thrown out a lot of information. So actually we're left with a subspace of possible solutions to the sketch linear system. And the next step then, you might be able to guess, is the projection step, where we simply project our iterate into the subspace of solutions from that sketched equation. Right, and the idea of sketch and project is just to do this over and over again. So we form another independent sketch, we get another subspace here, we do another projection, and you can see that if we keep iterating this process, then we will actually get closer and closer to the true solution. And so this is a nice way of solving linear systems, but why do we care about this? So the first reason we care is there's actually a very close connection between the sort of machine learning setting and sketching. So you can view, in machine learning, we usually always optimize by only looking at a small amount of the data at each iteration, which is called mini-batching. And this turns out to be actually a special case of sketching. So there's sort of a structural compatibility here. And the second reason is actually something that has been really only developed in the last couple of years on the theoretical side, which really says that sketch and project can actually have a implicit preconditioning effect. Even though you're not explicitly preconditioning like a Newton method, it can still achieve the same thing and accelerate the convergence. And so to give you like a very sketchy, well, yeah, no pun intended, sketchy version of this, if you have like the matrix A that you're solving the linear system of and you have a singular values that are like decaying like this, then your original condition number is like the ratio between the largest and smallest singular values. And here that's about 1,000. And it turns out that when you run gradient descent, the convergence rate is controlled by this 1,000. When you run sketch and project, say with a sketch size of 15, you can actually cut off the top part of this singular value spectrum, and then you can get convergence with respect to a reduced condition number. This is kind of a hand-wavy way of saying it, but there's sort of many theorems pointing to the same idea in many different contexts that have been developed over the last few years. And so, in other words, what we have is we have this sketch and project paradigm, which is both scalable because of the sketching, and it actually has a chance at least to attain higher precision than gradient-based methods due to this implicit preconditioning effect. And so, so that at least tells us why this is interesting, but before we can actually do something with this, then we need to go one step farther and say, like, how do we actually get from the linear system setting to the setting of scientific machine learning? And I'm kind of going to fly through this, but the idea here is you can think of all of these scientific machine learning problems as some sort of composite optimization structure where there's an outer and an inner loss function, or there's an outer loss function and then there's a model. And there's a very powerful method for these kinds of systems called natural gradient descent, which basically has the goal of removing sort of all the complexity of the model. So you can think that like if the model v theta, that's like a neural network parameterized with parameters theta, that's a very messy, ill-conditioned, nonlinear object. We want to try to take that out of the optimization and optimize over a much smoother, simpler problem. And it turns out that actually the way to do this is you can write down sort of what the target optimization step you would want to do that minimizes this loss function. You can then write down what an actual step does, And what happens is you actually get a linear system constraining the parameter update theta t plus 1, where the left-hand side is related to this J matrix, which is the Jacobian of the model. So this you have to kind of stare at and understand what I'm talking about, but the point is that we have this natural gradient method, which we know is sort of powerful for scientific machine learning, and it actually translates to some sort of a linear system that you have to solve. And so this gives us the connection to the sketch and project idea. And so with that, I just want to say, what can you actually do with this? So we have this optimization challenge. We have these sketch and project methods that look promising. And our main proposal is this thing we call the Spring algorithm, which stands for subsampled projected increment natural gradient descent. And basically, this is a direct application of the ideas I've been talking about, which is you take the sketch and project, you take the sketch and project method. There are known variants of this with accelerated convergence using something called Nesterov acceleration. So we take a Nesterov accelerated sketch and project method, we apply it to this linear system that I talked about on the previous slide, and we use this as an optimizer not for linear systems, but for scientific machine learning. And so this is a pretty simple idea, but it actually works quite well. So this is for neural wave functions. We train some simple systems. So this is just some single atoms, a carbon atom and an oxygen atom, trying to find really, really precise ground state wave functions. And here we see that relative to some previous methods, this sketch and project spring optimizer is able to both converge a lot faster and converge to higher accuracy than the previous approaches. And this is for atoms. We can see the same thing for diatomics, for carbon-oxygen, and for a nitrogen molecule. In addition, so this was actually the N2 is sort of a paradigmatic, like, strong correlation example. So this was as far as we went in our original work. But in addition to this, actually last year, some other groups picked up this stuff, and one of them did this pretty cool simulation of this iron-sulfur complex, which is like many times bigger than the things we did. This is on like 250 electrons, kind of a cutting-edge strong correlation simulation, and this was also using the Spring optimizer. So this is kind of an indication that this is something not just for small toy problems, but also for more serious high-performance computing problems. And additionally, we then tried this for physics-informed neural networks. So here we have the version without acceleration, we call SNG, is actually already a new method for physics-informed neural networks, which performs quite well in low-dimensional settings. And then in high-dimensional settings, we're able to see that the acceleration actually, I don't know if you can see the light green curve, but the acceleration actually helps a good deal, and the spring then becomes very important in higher dimensional settings. And yeah, so additionally, I'm not going to say a lot about this, but there is sort of that was the practical results. The theory part is that there was this sketch and project stuff for consistent linear systems. Scientific machine learning is for inconsistent nonlinear systems. So after we sort of developed the algorithm, we spent a while trying to understand why this really works. And with a few results on trying to bridge this gap of understanding the inconsistent case, and some very preliminary, but I think still meaningful results on how do you understand this in the nonlinear setting. I'm just trying to sort of put this on a more firm grounding theoretically. And with that, I'd just like to summarize. So we have this question we started with of what kind of optimizers are good for scientific machine learning. And we now at least have a few candidates. We have this sketch and project paradigm, which seems like a promising way to think about it. We have a couple of algorithms that work pretty well. I think that these are really the tip of the iceberg. So there's a bunch of ongoing work we're doing to try to further develop the implications of this, develop more advanced optimizers based on things other than natural gradient descent for other related problems. But that's sort of the main idea. And yeah, with that, I'd just like to thank all of you for listening, and thank the CSGF and the Krell Institute for all the support over the last few years.